laggy and stuff. Oh, thank you, Nate. Appreciate it. So, and I apologize if my video is a little laggy. Long story short, I was trying to replace sprinkler pipe and accidentally severed my Wi-Fi connection at my house. So I am actually at a different location trying to use their Wi-Fi. So apologies there. Hopefully you guys can still hear me okay. Thank you everyone for coming. If you haven't yet, if you could just drop in the chat your name and your organization so we can just grab a little bit of attendance there. There should be a little thing that pops up down at the bottom for your chat. And we appreciate you guys getting in and trying out this new platform that we're trying to find. We're just trying to find a good option that will allow us to do all the things that we need to do to allow us to have the amount of people that we want to have in these meetings, and then also is a cost-effective solution. So awesome. So we will probably try, and so as long as this goes well today, we'll probably keep trying to have meetings in these. Real quickly, since we are doing that, I just wanted to announce one little thing real quick. So next month in May, we will not have a meeting. Instead, we are doing a fundraiser with Mod Pizza, and that's going to be on the 15th. Am I right, Sage? On the 15th, right? Yes, the 15th. Yes. And so let me share my screen just real quick so you guys can see this flyer. I did send this out yesterday in the newsletter, and I know this is probably kind of hard to see, but we are doing this awesome fundraiser. So basically all day, either if you go to Mod Pizza and you bring in this flyer or order online, there's a code below. Then really what they will do is donate 20% of your bill towards supporting this awesome stuff. So encourage your friends and family, encourage everybody you know to order from Mod Pizza on May 15th to benefit the IDOVS group. And so that will help us be able to use that money into try and do some things that we want. We're trying to get mentorship programs going. We are also trying to work on bringing back the opportunity to be able to help send people to conferences and things like that for either discounted or sponsored rates. And so that money will help us do all those things for you guys so that we can offer those awesome benefits to you. So. Then without further ado, since we're kind of dropping our stuff into the chat there, I'm going to go ahead and let Jonny start off. So Jonny is here, and he is going to tell us a little bit about himself and talk to us today about advocating for yourself and your profession. So Jonny, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonny Carkin. I am the Director of Operations for the Early Learning Collaborative Program at Idaho Association for the Education of Young Children. It's a mouthful, or Idaho AEYC, the short version. I've been working in public affairs for about 15 years in Idaho. I started, managing state legislative campaigns, running volunteer operations, field operations. I worked for a nonprofit for a number of years where I actually oversaw the volunteer program. And then since then, I worked for a national public affairs firm where I ran political campaigns and often ran field operations that needed volunteers. And so I do know a little bit about volunteer management and things like that. It's been a little while since I've managed them, but I still remember a few things about how to run those programs. Most of my role these days, until recently, was really focused on advocacy, more so in the vein of affecting public policy or elections. But a lot of those kind of lessons kind of ring true across the sector, no matter what. Excuse me. So just to start off, one other little caveat too is, I do a lot of advocacy trainings, and it's more so in the vein of how to advocate for like larger systems or macro level change. So we'll finish with a little bit of that, and hopefully some of those lessons will reflect back on kind of both advocating for yourself and for your volunteer program intra-organizationally. Oh, I need to share my screen. I'm glad I caught that. I would have been talking and you have no idea what I was referencing. So I want to start with just kind of defining advocacy. So advocacy is the need to advocate arises from a desire to change an environment or circumstance to fix a problem or right a wrong. And this happens at kind of the micro level or the individual level. We all advocate every day, whether we're advocating for our children, our families, our position at work. And when we do that, we want to change something. We want to improve something. And the same is true at the macro level. When we want to influence policy, we want to right a wrong or seek a change to a system. Let's start with advocating for yourself. So we all work in the nonprofit realm. We all are, I think, mission driven, I'm going to assume. We're not in for this for the money. So you need to be fulfilled in your role and making sure that your needs are being met. Also, you need to be supported by your organization, both so you can do your job effectively, but also identifying opportunities for growth, opportunities for professional development, and ensuring that you have what you need to do your job effectively. And then lastly, make sure you're compensated. This is hard work, and I know firsthand it's not always, the most lucrative field to be in, but we do it because it's meaningful and it impacts people's lives, and we get something out of that. I'd like to take a minute right here and just say, asking for the group, if anyone wants to offer up anything let's start with. What are ways in which your organization has supported your growth or your development in your position? Either through a PD opportunity or something like that.
For me, a couple of ways. Our organization will pay for some learning opportunities each year so that I can grow either in my specific position or just generally professionally, which I appreciate that. And something else that I think isn't always part of every organization, but is part of my organization right now, is that when I come across challenges, my supervisor directly asks me, "What can I do to support you?" Which is, wonderful to have someone who wants to learn and to hear my perspective about what's needed rather than making assumptions about what I would need. So those are two things that are big for me.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Can anybody offer up an example of something you struggle with to be supported by your organization in your role? Or have in the past at maybe a different role if you don't want to put your current employer on blast?
I've worked for a lot of organizations that are fairly big, they're like national or international organizations. And so it can be a little bit hard to make people understand at the higher scale, like what exactly your job looks like and how important that is at the micro scale. But the decisions that come down are happening at that macro scale. So it's a little bit harder to kind of be able to convey, exactly, the differences, the nuances of a certain territory, things like that, to a larger, more national group, and for them to be able to take that into consideration when they're making those higher level decisions that do affect us. So.
No, that's a great point. I think that's something that's pretty common, especially with larger organizations. I worked for a large organization, like a tri-state affiliate, and ran the regional volunteer program. And we have a pretty good line to our executive director to kind of voice our concerns and explain our needs. And I think most of the time, because of having that opportunity and access the executive director and kind of a team setting and kind of be able to share our challenges was a good way to do it. And it did yield some really positive results. But oftentimes, we're all constrained by budgets and we're all constrained by resources. And so having a opportunity in your position to speak with like leadership, even at that like not that larger level, is really important. And some organizations, like the volunteer person, doesn't really have that access. And so one thing that I would recommend advocating for is having a line or having an opportunity to be able to express your challenges and communicate what those barriers are for yourself or your program, to that kind of C-suite level of management. And if you don't have it, that's something to talk to your supervisor about providing that opportunity, because it's important for that C-suite level or that manager level to understand like what's really going on the ground. Because volunteer programs, like, they exist because the ROI is so great, both in terms of like executing certain missions or tasks, but also because it's really core, it's generally very core to an organization's kind of like identity. Having people volunteer their time and effort to support your cause is really valuable. And if they don't recognize that value and aren't like supporting you in that role in order to sustain that and grow it, it can be really problematic. So I think one of the first steps is like having a direct line from your position to general leadership. Any other insights about challenges with resources or management that people can think of?
I'll jump in. One of the challenges that I didn't really realize until as of late was everyone has their own also personal comfortability with management. So the example I give is, in my head, I'm like, oh, all volunteer managers can manage volunteers. And I got a phone call from one of our volunteer partners who manages volunteers, and she's like, we have 10 volunteers. I should probably get a second person, huh? And I'm like, I have 400 people coming and I'm just like divvying out groups. Like, but in my head, again, as a volunteer manager, I didn't process that difference of comfortability for people and what they feel comfortable with, and how that, for me, I've adapted over time. And how some people are at different spots, even as volunteer managers, which again changes how you outlook of being able to pull community members in as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, it is. I've been there, and it is interesting to develop the skill set to be able to kind of an organizational structure to manage large groups and to manage different projects. One thing that I really benefited from in my role was I had a peer group of other organizers within our tri-state network that I could really like kind of latch onto and meet with regularly to help me like troubleshoot things, how to build systems in place to facilitate that management. And then also like when big things come up or challenges, like sometimes capacity is needed, and sometimes that is in the terms of like if you have a big event coming up, like being able to have the funds to hire like an event manager if it's something that's not with your skill set, and being able to communicate that effectively with your management to ensure that like if you want this to go off successfully, it needs to happen. But also like working together and understanding that like if you've built kind of a process that's valuable, and being able to share that with other members of your team or other volunteer managers or coordinators within that. Trish, did you have something to add?
Yeah, when you brought up building out processes and things like that, it kind of lit a bulb in my head that I know I struggle here with the state being a statewide coordinator, and I kind of filter down to region and park coordinators, and trying to implement new processes and things. See, my position, I kind of don't really live anywhere specifically. Like I fall under operations for the jobs we do, but then I answer to HR, but I don't really have much for like, any teeth to my position to get anybody on board with processes and things like that. So my predecessor was fantastic, but she operated in a very supportive role. And some of the emphasis that's been placed on me is to operate more in accountability, make sure everybody is going through the processes they're supposed to, but I do that with no teeth, if that makes any sense. And so that is a challenge to implement those processes. Like you were saying, that, how do you get people to buy in to see the need for these processes without, any stick to go with the carrot?
No, that's a good point. And I'm guessing the people like under you are like paid positions, or like, are they volunteers as well?
No, they're paid positions. They're park rangers. So the managing of the volunteers within their park level is just an added responsibility onto an already full plate. And so some are very motivated and some are not very motivated to follow the practices that have been put in place.
Yeah. So that's interesting. And like, because you have to leverage like soft power in order to encourage people, and that's tricky, because if people aren't bought into the idea, or think is like, oh, it's just the other thing I have to do, they'll do the bare minimum. And so, in that instance, it would be, maybe something that you could engage higher ups about buy-in on the part of those people that help facilitate those programs, kind of externally from you, or that have to handle kind of that, and setting base benchmarks for them. And that there are ways with like kind of the soft power of, like, oh, this is so great. Like, setting attainable goals for them, celebrating those goals with them, kind of helping to understand their contribution and the importance of that piece of their work to the larger picture. Sometimes that's through relationship development, and sometimes that's through identifying what kind of makes them tick, and identifying what within their own scope of work that they care about, that they prioritize, and help making the connection about like why that volunteer piece is so crucial toward executing that particular goal or that piece that they do. Aside from that soft power piece, again, this is kind of like advocating for yourself within your position, is talking to management about, without maybe calling out specific people, but bringing it to them as, this is something that I'm seeing kind of a system wide, where there's not the appropriate level of buy-in and follow through on the part of people that I'm supposed to like manage softly. And so if it comes from a different voice, or if you can work with like an administrator or a manager to set some kind of like base level expectations around that role. So it's not like you're not the bad guy and you're not the one calling them out. But also like communication is key. So if there is an opportunity where that manager can facilitate like ongoing check-ins, where you are able to really interrogate kind of like what that what the holdup is, or what the resistance to that is, can really be really important. And then back to Nathan's comment too about like just the overall. And sorry, before I get to Nathan, let me finish with Sage. We talked about like creation of like programs and systems in place, but having kind of someone above you, or like someone that's above you and the people that you kind of tangentially serve, have them set the policy themselves, so that they're, I want to say forced, but required to be really more responsive, and are required to kind of view that role in a more serious manner. So it's kind of two things. It's kind of like the soft approach of developing that relationship, identifying kind of what that, making the connection between what their priorities are and the value of the role that you want them to fill, and having kind of like a organizational structure in place that helps you to kind of facilitate that. Does that make sense? And then Nathan, to your part about when people are overwhelmed, like, oh, I've got 10 volunteers and you're like, I work with 400. I think like internal, trainings that are scalable, but also can identify like what a larger capacity thing kind of reflects. And so, I remember we developed all sorts of different like trainings and, process books on like, if we're having like a fundraiser, we need to have this staff. So it's always working backwards. It's just like a set plan so that there is a checklist of like, I need, this many positions. I have these various roles that I need to fill to execute this. I don't know if your roles, like we operate, especially in the political realm and like but the rule of halves, is that something people are familiar with? So like if you need 10 volunteers to show up, you should probably schedule 20. And that's not always the case. If you're like an organization that has a very dedicated volunteer base, then you could probably lower that number quite a bit and maybe schedule a few extra shifts accounting for some no-shows or things like that. But gauge what you like. But oftentimes in political operations, you abide by the rule of halves. And so it's really kind of reflective of what your volunteer culture is like to really gauge what those metrics would be, and then create those systems and kind of just like a to-do list or a plan to help new volunteer coordinators adjust to doing larger capacity things. And then moving on, so compensation, a big one, especially in the nonprofit world. Advocating for yourself in terms of what your pay is. You all facilitate free work, your volunteer managers, and the cost of what that would often take to actually like implement that would be far greater what they invest in you. So it's always great to make that case about the value you bring and being able to like ensure that certain metrics are being met, that things are staffed, and that you're good at it, and that we all need to live, we all need to pay our bills, and I know firsthand like how challenging it can be too, working in the nonprofit sector, but the nonprofit sector in general, I think, represents like 10% of the American workforce, and we are largely the safety net for the country. And so, in order to meet this mission, your missions, it's really important to be able to communicate that with your leadership, and not just with your executive director, but like making that clear to your board and identifying like what avenues you have to your board to make the case for why your program is important and why they need to invest in your position to ensure that work gets done. Oh, and was it Sage that had a comment?
I think it's Trish has her hand up.
Trish, sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. I just wanted to add on to that something that I use pretty regularly when I do my reporting to our board and other executive team members. Independentsector.org has a really good chart on it on the value of volunteer time. And so I'm able to tag that onto my reports to give a monetary value to our volunteer program. It's always done a year in the rears. And so I haven't seen the report for 2025, which would reflect 2024. But in 2023, Idaho's rate for volunteers hours is $30.12 an hour is the value of volunteers. I don't know. That seems a little heavy with me, but it factors in a full-time employee plus their fringe benefits in place of that volunteer. So it's a really good report that I like to use when I'm giving some monetary value to our program.
And I'm sure that most of us can relate in that we're definitely not being paid that. So that's even higher than most of what we get paid.
Yeah, great resource.
I actually pulled that up as you were talking, Trish, and it tells us why it's calculated that way. And it's because of the fact that we're asking people that have specialties like doctors, nurses. Idaho utilizes a lot of people that they do have that main focus. And so that, I mean, it does probably average out to that. We're asking, I mean, I gave the example a little bit earlier before everyone jumped on, but I'm asking people to bring chainsaws and heavy equipment where they probably would be getting paid at least $30, if not more, because it's their equipment, their item, they're bringing it out. But at the end of the day, like, it looks like it makes sense that it averages out that way. Because again, we're talking people who also do specialty type items.
Well, that, and when you look at a full-time employee, you know, your full-time pay is not reflective of the cost of a full-time employee because of all of the fringe benefits with time off and medical and things like that. So it does kind of make sense. But yeah, when we start advocating for our program and we're outlining that we have, you know, 480 host volunteers that served 25,000 hours last year, yeah, it definitely works out to be a chunk of change, and that's an eye-opener for sure.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great resource. And I'd also say, like, too, when negotiating or talking to your supervisor about what your compensation is, like, look at like where you live and what the actual cost of living is. Like, look at things like, you know, like regional median income, cost of rent, things like those need to be reflective and in wages, and ensuring that you're not just like living in a, you know, or what's the term, just like hand to mouth kind of way. But you all are professionals. You all have a certain skill set you bring that is very unique, and is worth an investment in. So before we move on to advocating for your volunteers, does anybody have anything else to add or things to share about self-advocacy within your organization? Okay. So let's talk about advocating for your volunteers. So, you know, first off, they need to feel useful. They're volunteering their time, and they want to make sure that like their time is well spent and that they're contributing something, they're making something happen, that they're making that connection to their effort into something, you know, if not tangible, something that's like meaningful. So ensuring that the circumstances exist where they're feeling that sense of usefulness, and that you are making the connection between the mission and their effort. They need to feel supported and recognized. You know, they need to be appreciated. They need to have the tools that they require to actually like do the work. And you should really be celebrating them for what they do. And I'm sure all of you, you know, do great work, and thanking them, you know, providing like adequate training. But, you know, some of those little things also are impactful, like just nice notes, thanking them for participating in an event, doing volunteer celebration events often. I know when I worked we did, I think 2 annual events where we just had like kind of a mixer for volunteers to come, and we'd hand out awards and do like, you know, provide some food and stuff and opportunities for people to speak and talk about their impact to really help bring a community together, let them know that they are part of a larger effort and a larger community. Sometimes volunteers will work like one-off shifts or with one other person, and may not be able to like kind of see the larger picture or the larger contribution, and having kind of opportunities for them to get together and share and celebrate is really important to volunteer retention in general. And then, you know, how can your organizations better support them? And so volunteers, you know, feeling useful and recognized is great, but like, is it an opportunity for them? Like, you know, help understanding like what their why is, you know, why do they show up? What do they hope to get out of that experience? And then looking to identify like what their motivation is, and seeing if you can connect them to other opportunities within your organization. I worked for one of the nonprofits I worked for where I ran the volunteer program. Is we had like a really specific ladder of engagement. So we had different varying levels of training. So there was like an entry point where people were allowed to went through a training and they were able to table. They're able to like make phone calls, do some other stuff. But then we had kind of like these stepping stones to develop greater skill sets. And sometimes we did lobby training. So we bring in like certain volunteers that were like, really articulate or like really understood the mission or just like really solid. And we would approach them and say like, hey, would you be interested in going through this training to advocate to lawmakers? And it's very, could be very scary to them. Like it's scary to a lot of people engaging in that kind of work. But like kind of helping them through it, the value and helping to kind of elevate their skill set and develop their skill set over time. But that takes resources and time. And so again, this goes back to kind of the ROI with your leadership and your boards. And so identifying what kind of opportunities that volunteers have to grow, both through like, potentially offering professional development opportunities for them within your organization or external. Are there programs or trainings they can take that are external from your organization that would really benefit them and by proxy benefit the work that they do for your organization? And again, it takes that kind of a clear plan, and we'll get into the kind of like the structure of this and the larger advocacy piece, because I think it'll be reflected back, but identify like what that benefit is to your organization and justifying that expense and what that can look like. Can people share like what kind of like elevated positions that you have in your organizations or professional development opportunities your organizations provide to volunteers?
Well, like for me, I work for the the Red Cross, and so one of the things so basically, I'm a fully remote worker, so over a very large territory: Idaho, Montana, parts of Oregon, parts of Washington, and so for me, I developed a lead volunteer program where they can kind of be more virtual in helping with doing scheduling. Helping me schedule other volunteers so they have higher level access to administrative side, things like that. They get a higher level training. They're higher level volunteers that help me be able to manage tons of volunteers across a very large territory. And, I even have a team that I built out to help with onboarding and training that are all lead volunteers that, that they essentially, they get the application. They're the ones doing the interviews of the other volunteers, and they're communicating with me about if they're going to be good fits and getting them scheduled for trainings and stuff. So they got this higher level access and higher level training that they participate in.
That's great. What is are people excited about that? Like, are volunteers like kind of jazzed at the idea of kind of advancing and like developing new skill sets?
Yeah, and I'm very selective in who I pick. So I try to pick people who know the role that they're primarily going to be working with the volunteers in. So, I require that they have done the role themselves. And so a lot of times then I will let them know like, hey, we are looking for this higher level person. And they're usually pretty excited about it. But of course, with that also comes a higher level of commitment. They have to have higher level training. They have to commit to a certain time frame that they are able to be in this role. And so things like that. So they understand that it's a higher level kind of thing, but they usually are very excited about that opportunity.
Trish?
So we have tried to implement something similar at a few of our locations as what Amanda, like a lead volunteer, where we've taken volunteers that have been with our program for a couple of seasons and we use them to train new volunteers coming in as hosts and maintenance and things like that. We do offer them CPR and first aid training. Usually most parks do across the board. And then if they do any advanced equipment, like Nathan was talking about with chainsaws or things like that, they have to get that kind of training. But we've actually kind of seen that in some instances backfire on us a little bit, where you have those volunteers that you're giving a level of leadership to really take ownership of the program. And when we have a high turnover of staff, sometimes our volunteers are so invested that they kind of push themselves onto the staff, and we have ended up in a couple of situations where we've had, some overstepping and things of that nature. So while I would love to say we have a great program where we can give them a higher level of training, it's been tough for us.
Like they boss like their managers around, kind of.
Yeah, they'll tell new rangers or new staff, well, your job is to provide me with this, or you're not implementing, you need to go down and talk to those people about their code violations or things like that, where they're starting to boss the staff around.
Yeah, I mean I've definitely heard of that before, and we've all experienced difficult volunteers. I don't know what recommendations I have to help alleviate that, aside from really having clear expectations and policies with volunteers in general. But sometimes personalities are personalities, and it's hard to push back against that at times. But I mean, it's great that, one thing I was going to emphasize is that kind of that hierarchy that we did have at that organization is it moved up, between being a citizen lobbyist, or helping organize events, and identifying people that really excel in those roles and advancing them up, to the point where we had a number of organizers that started out as volunteers. And so it was that pipeline that we created that actually got them into positions of leadership and of staff, and they developed those skills along the way. So we always have a comment, you probably heard it, is you organize yourself out of a job, but in this case you're just kind of bringing up the next generation. But I hear your downside of that. Trish. Sorry, so one of the other people that chimed in.
I was gonna say something that I haven't ever seen before, but that is part of an offering that I get to provide to our volunteers. Our paid staff and board, and then our core team, our most faithful volunteers, all have access to a learning platform through our global organization, and it wouldn't be possible if it was just our local chapter to do something like this, I don't think. And so it is a luxury, I recognize. But one of the things that I love about that is that because there are learning opportunities that are offered to all, then they can manage their own learning. They can pick which opportunities make sense to them based on their interests. And I love that, because not everyone takes advantage of it. In fact, one of my goals in the near future is to figure out how to present it to my team to help them understand the value that's there for professional development. Although many of mine are retired, so they're not necessarily interested in that. But a lot of people become connected to us because they love how much we care. And there are a lot of resources about boundary setting, or about ways to be cared the best way, right? Because when you're caring for people who are ill, or who have a child who just passed away, there's some really important differences in what you would do or say, right, than what is our instinctual thing. And so those kinds of trainings are so valuable. So I'm really grateful for that resource, all that to say. And I feel like if I didn't have it, having now, if I moved somewhere else and didn't have that resource, I would be trying to build something, or some repository of here's what would help you in your role as part of our organization. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. I know there's, I got the benefit of working with, we had someone on our staff at the national level that her specialty was in adult learning. And she would work with us to create, modules to we identify kind of like what roles we wanted to fill and kind of that advancement structure, and the trainings that go with that. And adult learning is so different than kind of like the K-12 or in my world, early education pedagogy. But having some of those systems in place, and this might be an investment on the case of your larger organization, is to invest in kind of those platforms where you can kind of develop trainings, and also maybe a consultant to help shape them in a way that is really structured around helping adults kind of absorb that information and develop those skills with which you want them to kind of pursue and develop. And there was someone who had a comment. Is that Trish?
Yeah, real quick, I wanted to ask Stephanie, do you have a grief counseling or something like that module specifically in your training regiment?
I don't think we have a grief counseling module that I've run across, but we do have like things, what you can say when someone is experiencing grief, right? So more equipping, because we are not, we're not medical professionals. We're not, therapists on our staff. That doesn't exist. That's not a role that our organization wants us to take on. So they don't really want us to pretend like we are, I guess, if that makes sense. But we do want to have enough emotional wisdom to know what we shouldn't say and how not to take on something, again, if that's not our role. So usually the trainings are more with that bent, if that makes sense.
Cool. Thank you, Stephanie. I was just curious because we have run into situations with our parks being remote and outdoor recreation oriented where we have had some of our volunteers not participate, but be exposed to death and trauma and stuff like that in the parks. And unfortunately, they don't have the same level of access as staff do to any kind of counseling or anything like that. So I was hoping that maybe there was a little bit of something to help our permanent staff that's on hand, facilitate something for volunteers when they run into those kinds of situations. But I will keep looking.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye out. I'm wondering too, I was just going to type this, but I'm wondering if like LinkedIn Learning would have something like that. And a lot of organizations do have organizational memberships to LinkedIn Learning that they can pass along to at least staff, if not to volunteers.
Okay.
All right, was there any more comments? I think I saw a few more. Okay. So yeah, like the opportunities for growth, really important aspect for a lot of your organizations, I think. And yeah, really making the case again with like management or board level people for those investments and either those kinds of trainings, systems, or external professional development opportunities that might be offered. So attending a conference or something like that for some of your select superstar volunteers. And then the part kind of about like celebrating them is being really clear to your management and to your board. Hopefully you have an avenue to both about what it really goes into volunteer retention and advancement. And so again, this goes back to kind of that ROI piece and explaining like, what comes, but what you get, what they get out of this organization wide by having a volunteer program that does all these great things and make sure that the care and watering is happening. So making sure that you have funds for food, making sure that you have funds for those professional development opportunities, make sure you have funds for celebrating them, like whether it's like an annual gala or just like a kind of mixer or something like that. But, they show up and they do awesome work. And it's really important that we celebrate them and support them and make them feel part of that larger community. And that takes funds sometimes. And so making sure that there's a clear line item in your budget do that kind of work is really important, and making sure that both your board and your management understands that. And one thing that it's interesting in nonprofits, because I've worked at some where boards were like kind of this like silo, or like the ivory tower, and they're oftentimes like not integrated with the staff. It can be a little challenging, and I think one of the big ways to address that is having kind of advocating for a direct line to your board, because boards often, membership changes at times. The culture can kind of shift at times based on that shift in membership. And having kind of a consistent touch point with a board to talk about your programs, to talk about your successes, to talk about your needs is really crucial, because even if you have an executive director that is maybe a little resistant to some of the things, having buy-in from the board can be a really powerful advocate. Your board should be an advocate for the work that you're doing, and they should have a really clear understanding. And sometimes they are a little bit divorced from like what happens on the ground, especially at the volunteer management level. But advocating for a direct connection with the board to help them understand that your program is a really critical piece of the overall mission and infrastructure of your organization is key. Right. Any other comments about this section or questions?
I just wanted to jump in. Advocating for our volunteers, I mean, that's what I always say. Advocating for myself comes secondary to advocating for my volunteers, because I get paid. And at the end of the day, I've even had the conversation with leadership. I'm like, if you're not wanting me to get the things that our volunteers need, then you're paying me a paycheck that, I can just sit here and say, hey, Jonny, thanks for volunteering. I appreciate it. That's all we got for you. But when you advocate for your volunteers, that in part advocates for yourself. It advocates for your role and the importance of your role. But I will say, I think when you are able to advocate effectively, clearly, ensuring that they understand to the extent, I dropped into chat the fact of like, if we're offering counseling for a death or dismemberment or a serious injury, and we're offering counseling to our staff, immediately that should be a conversation of, we are offering this to people who we pay to be here. Why not people who are free? Again, getting that leverage of, this is what they're offering, and they're offering it of their like good heart, goodwill. Again, and there are a lot of resources out there. The hard thing is I love our staff, and we do have counselors and therapists on staff that I could work with, but I would never want my staff to manage that at that level. That is something that we as an organization, to support our volunteers, need to kind of put in place. But again, advocating, ensuring the volunteers know that they're taken care of is what it usually falls back to, because the moment that they don't, they're going to stop volunteering. They're going to stop being as supportive or showing up. And once again, you can get into that advocation, you end up advocating for yourself in the long run, which is amazing.
Yeah, that's a great point, great frame. I like that. And the fringe is important. I think you might have a good point. What the services your organization provides, is it something your volunteers could take part in? People are often there, depending on what mission you serve, are there because they have a connection to it. They care about it. Is there an opportunity for them to be able to get some of those resources or have access to some of those things too? So I worked for Planned Parenthood. That's the organization I worked for. And we had a thing, if you logged so many volunteer hours in a certain time, you get access to healthcare in the clinics. And so we had a lot of people actually, volunteer in order to, get their birth control or IUDs or things like that. And so it was kind of a fringe, and it was very much a carrot. They did care about it, but if we're going to, expend all this, time and advocating for policy and stuff and leveraging their time, then, it's not a huge sacrifice on the part of the organization to provide those services for free. So looking at like, when you're advocating for your volunteers, like how can you fold them into or provide them with those services and make sure that they feel part of that organization and they're benefiting as much as the people they're serving through that organization or through your programs in general. But yeah, I love the point. Yeah, advocating for your volunteers in your program is, antecedent to volunteering or advocating for yourself in your role by kind of making clear the value of the program and the work that they do. Right. So next up is just advocating for your mission or your program. So this is kind of the macro level stuff. And let me know if this isn't like applicable to you, but oftentimes when we're in volunteer positions, we are advocating for a larger mission, and sometimes that kind of crosses the realm into like larger systems changes. And a lot of times when I do a lot of trainings on policy advocacy specifically, and a lot of times there is a lot of hesitation about engaging in this process because it can be daunting. Oftentimes when you talk about like political advocacy or issue advocacy, people bring to mind like large political movements like the civil rights movement, the workers' rights movement, or large scale political operations. And it can be very daunting. But really, like advocacy is just an umbrella term at the macro level that involves identifying, embracing, and promoting a cause. So small steps of talking to your family, neighbors, and friends about an issue you care about is advocacy. Hosting a small get-together of concerned individuals to discuss how an issue affects your community is advocacy. And having a meeting with a local decision maker about something are all examples of this. And when we look at large political operations and large advocacy movements, they all start from these initial steps. And so, how do we change hearts and minds at the macro level? I think there's some kind of lessons to be like gleaned from kind of that advocating for volunteers, but engagement and education, providing just the data and the stories about how a particular thing impacts a community, impacts a sector, building local capacity and meeting the needs of your community. So this is about coalition building, about identifying other people in your community that also care about this, identifying other interested parties that may represent other sectors but have a stake in what you're trying to advance, and then collectively creating a demand for action. So, it's our job to accurately describe the realities of what families and children and other stakeholders like face, and being able to flag what the issue is and what the change needs to happen. But oftentimes, especially with decision makers, if it's just one person or one particular group of people, sometimes it's seen as being like, oh, it's their issue. We don't care about that. But being able to bring in other sectors, being able to bring in other voices representing different constituencies really helps elevate an issue and puts it on their radar in a way that they might not have considered it prior. And then collectively create a demand for action is kind of how we kind of broach that or break through kind of that resistance and creating kind of a large scale public demand. Importance of community voice. So one of the things we do to like prep people for engaging in advocacy, especially with like meeting with lawmakers or things like that, is helping them understand that you are the expert about your needs. Your perspectives and experiences need to be considered in policy decisions. And this quote here, it came from an old newspaper guy in Eastern Idaho. And he told me and my boss one time, he's like, 100 kids is a statistic. One kid is a story. And what he meant by that is oftentimes decision makers are inundated with data, spreadsheets, reports, all this kind of stuff. And oftentimes they legislate or make decisions, kind of viewing the impacts as a bit of an abstraction. But when you go to them and you talk about like one family, one child, one person who is impacted by your work, it makes it real for them. And it kind of removes their work as being an abstraction and helps them reflect and acknowledge the actual real impacts their decisions make on a community. And then multiple stories from multiple perspectives of what elevates an issue. So again, going back to that coalition framework and having lots of different people from various points of view and interests all talking about the same thing and identifying why it's important is what really breaks through. And I'll just reiterate that you are the experts about your needs, because this, I think, applies to your own positions and advocating for yourselves and your volunteers. No one knows your program better than you do. No one knows your program, or no one knows the impact on the community that your volunteers and your programs have better than you. And so don't be shy at really kind of saying that from the rooftops. I always make this flippant comment in my trainings that usually gets a good reaction, but I always like to say legislators are experts about few things, if any. While it is kind of flip, it is like accurate, because any decision maker, come from various backgrounds. They deal with such a broad area of policy that it's impossible for them to really understand kind of the intricacies and impacts on everything from healthcare to finance to tax law to criminal justice to, whatever. So having those experts, being you or being the people that you serve, elevated in that position, is really important, and really letting them know that they are the experts is empowering and helps them kind of get through any of that trepidation or nervousness about engaging this. And then how to effectively tell your story. So this, I think, applies to all sorts of different facets, whether you're engaging with lawmakers or engaging with your board or administrators. Your experience, how does your program or policy or lack thereof affect you and your family, your community? Make the connection about people in your community, including lawmakers, should also care about this issue. How does it affect other things they view as important? So I work in early childhood care and education advocacy. And personally, I feel like the healthy development of young children is an end in of itself. However, that sentiment is not shared with a lot of lawmakers, unfortunately. So we often have to make a case of what the impacts of doing this have on other facets of society. So we make the case for, and by investing in early education, we're going to see kids coming into kindergarten more ready to learn. They're not going to be behind. They're far less likely to require costly interventions, more likely to graduate high school. Because while a lot of lawmakers might not care about early education, a lot of them care about K-12 education and the success and efficiency of that system. Also on the side of childcare, we use kind of the economic lens to make our case. And that is, people need to work and spend time with their families, and they need to have access to affordable quality childcare so that they can remain in the workforce, so that employers have a pool of talented employees that they can rely on. Access to childcare reduces issues related to recruitment and retention, and absenteeism. And then always offer up a solution. So what is the change that you would like to see, and how can they help? So come prepared with a solution. And I think this applies to working with your own board and with your own leadership and advocating for your volunteers and yourselves. It's one thing to point out a problem, but if you can develop a pathway or a solution to address that, you're going to go a lot farther. And this might not be applicable, but I always like to show kind of like who holds the levers, influence, and power. And this is, pertains to the policy level, but, state and federal elected officials, I'm guessing a lot of our programs are federally funded, at least in part. Engagement with federal elected officials and their staff is really important to highlight the important work that you do. State officials as well, being able to kind of point to what the impact your programs have on your local communities. Municipal and county officials are kind of in there in the same vein. Administrators have a kind of unique position because they're charged with really implementing laws and programs and processes, and have a relationship with lawmakers to help gauge what the efficacy of certain laws are, how things are going, what needs to be changed. Community leaders, sometimes we refer to this as grass tops. So who within your community or your organization has a bit of an outsized voice, is an expert, or is commonly listened to for other people in power. Businesses and faith leaders are also among them. And then again, when we do talk about kind of like that macro level policy change, who is the audience and what moves them? So identifying like what a particular person's why is themselves, like what do they care about? What are their priorities? Is there a connection you can make between the work that you do with the things that they care about? So again, I reference, like making the case to support early childhood education and access to affordable quality care. And sometimes that, we're speaking to policymakers who care about business development and things like that. So the connection is made in the kind of the business lens. What values do you want to capture in your message? What are the values that they care about, and how does it relate to your work? And then again, data versus personal stories. Data is great. You want to show evidence. You want to show efficacy of your program. You want to show efficacy of the work that you're doing. But it's always really important to share those personal stories to provide the narrative piece. And so the rule we abide by is narrative punctuated by data. So the storytelling is the most important part. That's the connecting piece with data to back it up. And then who is the most powerful voice in delivering that message? And this is really just an example of how we frame the issue that I work on. And see, these are just some poll tested talking points that we use. So too many families in our community do not have the access to quality, affordable early care and education opportunities for their children. Parents also struggle to find the quality childcare they need so they can work and provide for their families. So this first one is kind of that values-based focus. Parents care about their children. They want them to have all the opportunities. Parents struggle to find quality care, and they need to remain in the workforce, and they want to provide for their families. So this is like caring about children, caring about families, and that kind of self-sufficiency piece that a lot of Idaho lawmakers care about, which is why we have that kind of frame in there. The next line is lack of access to early childhood programs has both immediate and long-term effects on our children, families, and local economy. Parents who cannot find access to early care and education aren't able to work, placing financial stress on families and limiting the pool of employees that our economy needs. So this one is more geared toward seeing an outcome, or focused on kind of like the economic realities and the larger economy, or the systems kind of approach. So we have first one, values. Second one, what is the tangible impacts on something they care about, chiefly economic well-being or workforce health and development. And that are all my slides. And so just want to take a minute and just see, like, from this larger, like kind of the macro level advocacy, if there are like things that you've identified that could be applied in that, both directly in that advocacy for both your programs, your volunteers, and for yourselves.
I was just gonna say, Jonny, I really liked that, like when you talked through like what should the message be. I feel like that's something that all of us could use at any level. Like I feel like I use that every day when I give a tour to someone who's a new donor or a potential volunteer, or they've never heard of us before, which happens a lot. You know, that having that way to structure the message is really helpful. But I think that if you can do it on a one-to-one basis, then you can probably do it on a much bigger scale. And you're equipping people to be potential, like that building up your pool of people who will be advocates within your community. So that was really helpful to me. Thank you for that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I think we all have our elevator pitches, and doing those volunteer ones. But yeah, but also providing your own volunteers, especially if they're interacting with the community, if they're tabling, if they're doing any kind of things like that, like having them prepared and having them dialed in on that message and the delivery, and kind of making the case across, different kind of interests and sectors. It's important. And also, like when you're making a case to a board, like, telling the story, like sharing the stories of your volunteers, like this person shows up, this is their background, this is the impact they made, helping them recognize that the volunteer program isn't just a light item on a budget they have to prove during their quarterly board meetings. So communicating that and making your volunteers real for them through like that narrative piece and through sharing stories. Thank you, Stephanie. Anything else? All right. Any other questions for me or?
I really appreciated your presentation today, Jonny. Got me thinking about different resources that we can find for helping our volunteers through different situations and things like that. So got some wheels turning. So I really appreciate that.
Okay,
Thanks.
good. Thank you. It's glad to hear it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonny. That was a really great presentation and something that, we can all benefit from, even if it's just taking little bits and pieces or the greater whole. That there's always some kind of advocacy we're doing every day. And so this is a really great thing to give us, like Trish said, give us some turning hamster wheels in our brains. So thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate it. And we will make this recording available to our members as well. And so we'll get that uploaded and get those links sent out soon. So awesome.
Amanda, maybe this is a natural point to remind everybody, because I think everybody who's here is a member. So if you haven't gone into the folder, Jessica was so great, and it's been about 2 months now since she sent out links to all of you to access that. So if you're ever having trouble getting to those recordings or to the notes that we take, those are usually uploaded same day. That's my goal anyway, as the secretary. But just if you ever are wanting to go take a look, we actually have records going back. If you haven't looked yet, we have records going back for some years now. So there's some resources available to you. Just want to remind you all of that. I feel like it's been a little bit since we put in a plug for that. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, and we're trying, of course, to also upload our recordings to a YouTube channel, which you guys should have that link, I believe, but we can always send it out again too, to make sure that everybody has access to those on our membership. So as part of the perks of your membership. So
yes, and I do also put the links to the recordings in the notes for the day. So if you click into the notes for today, it will, as soon as that link is live, it'll have that link. So that's another way to get to it.
Awesome. Bryn, yes.